The Discovery commander, Jake Morrison, had been stationed at research outposts 7 for 3 years, and he thought he had seen everything the Outer Rim could throw at him. The station floated in the void between the Kepler system and the Veil. Nebula, a lonely sentinel monitoring cosmic radiation and mapping uncharted space. It was quiet work, predictable work, the kind that let a man think too much about the family he left behind on Earth. The morning everything changed started like any other. Jake was running his routine diagnostics on the station's sensors when something unusual caught his attention. The external cameras had picked up a small object drifting toward the station, tumbling slowly in the zero gravity. At first, he assumed it was space debris, perhaps a fragment from one of the asteroid mining operations in the nearby belt. But as the object drew closer, Jake realized it was moving with purpose, not just drifting. He enhanced the image and felt his breath catch in his throat. It was a creature, no bigger than a house cat, with scales that shimmered like polished obsidian. Delicate wings, torn and damaged, trailed behind its small body. Even through the grainy camera feed, Jake could see it was struggling, its movements becoming weaker with each passing minute. Jake had heard stories about the dragon clans that lived in the deep regions of space. Ancient beings who soared between stars and built cities on the backs of cosmic whales. Most humans dismissed them as myths, elaborate stories told by long-haul freighter pilots to pass the time. But here was living proof, and it was clearly in distress. The creature managed to reach the station's outer hull, its tiny claws scraping against the metal as it searched for an entry point. Jake watched in fascination as it found an emergency airlock and began tapping on the viewport with what looked like desperate determination. The sound echoed through the station's corridors, a rhythmic plea that tugged at something deep in Jake's chest. Against every regulation in the book, Jake made his decision. He sealed off the airlock section and began the emergency cycle, his heart racing as he prepared to potentially let an unknown alien species into his home. The atmospheric readings showed the creature could survive in human-standard air, which was either an incredible coincidence or something far more significant. When the inner door finally opened, Jake got his first close look at the dragon. It was even smaller than he had thought, no bigger than a kitten, with scales that shifted from deep purple to midnight black, depending on the light. Its eyes were large and intelligent, a brilliant silver that seemed to hold depths of wisdom, far beyond its apparent age. Those eyes looked up at Jake with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The dragon was clearly starving. Its scales were dull and brittle, and Jake could see the outline of its ribs beneath the thin membrane of its wings. It tried to stand, but stumbled, too weak to support its own weight. Without hesitation, Jake knelt down and carefully scooped the creature into his hands, marveling at how light it felt, like holding a bird made of warm metal. He carried the dragon to his quarters and set it down gently on his bunk. From his emergency supplies, he pulled out a nutrition bar and broke off a small piece, offering it to the creature. The dragon sniffed it cautiously, then began to eat with the desperate hunger of someone who had not seen food in days. As it ate, Jake noticed something remarkable happening. The dragon's scales began to regain their luster, shifting from dull grey to rich, vibrant colors that seemed to pulse with inner light. After the dragon had eaten its fill, it looked up at Jake with what he could only describe as gratitude. It made a series of soft musical sounds, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, and Jake found himself smiling despite the absolute impossibility of the situation. He had always been good with animals, but this was something entirely different. This creature was intelligent, possibly more so than many humans he had known. Jake decided to call the dragon Ember, after the way its scales seemed to glow like dying coals. Ember appeared to approve of the name, responding with a pleased trill, and what looked suspiciously like a smile. Over the next few hours, Jake watched in amazement as Ember began to explore the station with boundless curiosity. The dragon seemed particularly fascinated by the computer displays, watching the scrolling data with an intensity that suggested understanding. It was during one of these observations that Jake noticed something extraordinary. Ember was not just watching the displays, it was reacting to them. When the cosmic radiation detector spiked, Ember's scales would shift to a particular shade of blue. When the gravitational sensors detected an anomaly, the dragon would point toward the source. With uncanny accuracy, it was as if Ember could sense the very forces that Jake's instruments were designed to measure. As the day wore on, Jake found himself talking to Ember as if the dragon could understand every word. Perhaps it could. The creature's responses were too precise, too relevant to be mere coincidence. When Jake explained how the station's life support systems worked, Ember nodded at all the right moments. When he described the loneliness of deep space duty, the dragon moved closer and made comforting sounds. The implications were staggering. If dragons could naturally sense cosmic forces, if they truly were as intelligent as Ember appeared to be, then humanity had been blind to the presence of a remarkable species. Jake began to wonder what other misconceptions humans held about the universe they thought they were exploring alone. As evening approached by the station's artificial day cycle, Jake prepared a more elaborate meal for Ember. He combined proteins and nutrients in proportions that seemed to appeal to the dragon's metabolism, creating something that was both nutritious and apparently delicious. Ember ate with obvious pleasure, its scales now glowing with vibrant health. That night, as Jake settled into his bunk with Ember curled up beside him, he felt a sense of companionship he had not experienced in years. The dragon's presence filled the station with warmth and life, transforming what had been a sterile workplace into something approaching a home. Jake drifted off to sleep with Ember's gentle breathing as a lullaby, unaware that his act of compassion was about to change the course of galactic history. The last thing Jake noticed before sleep claimed him was the way Ember's scales pulsed, with a rhythmic light, like a heartbeat made visible. It was beautiful, hypnotic, and somehow familiar, as if he had seen that pattern before in dreams he could not quite remember. Outside the station's viewports, the stars continued their eternal dance, but something had changed in the cosmic order. Word was already spreading through channels Jake could not imagine, carried by means he could not comprehend, that a human had shown kindness to a child of the ancient clans. The bond forms. Jake woke to find Ember perched on his chest, those silver eyes studying his face with what seemed like amused affection. The dragon had apparently been watching him sleep, waiting patiently for him to wake up. The moment Jake opened his eyes, Ember trilled a greeting that sounded remarkably like good morning, in some musical language that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the heart. Over breakfast, Jake began to notice just how remarkable his new companion truly was. Ember did not just eat. It savored each bite with the appreciation of a true connoisseur. More impressive still, the dragon seemed to understand the concept of sharing. When Jake offered a piece of his own meal, Ember accepted it graciously, then carefully tore off a portion of its own food and offered it in return. The gesture was so fundamentally civilized that Jake felt a shift in his understanding of what intelligence meant, the morning routine that had become second nature to Jake. Over 3 years of solitary duty was transformed by Ember's presence. The dragon followed him through the station with obvious curiosity, watching intently as Jake performed his daily maintenance checks. When Jake calibrated the sensors, Ember would position itself near the displays, its scales shifting colors. In response to the readings, it was like having a living, breathing sensor that could detect things Jake's instruments might miss. The breakthrough came when Jake was troubleshooting the persistent glitch in the gravitational wave detector. He had been working on the problem for weeks, unable to identify the source of the interference that was corrupting his readings. Ember watched him work for several minutes, then suddenly flew to a specific panel and began tapping it with its claws. The tapping followed a distinct pattern, rhythmic and purposeful. Jake followed the dragon's guidance and opened the panel. Inside, he found a loose connection that had been causing the interference. It was located in exactly the spot where Ember had been tapping, buried so deep in the system that it would have taken Jake days to find it through conventional troubleshooting. The dragon had somehow sensed the electrical irregularity and guided him to the solution. From that moment on, Jake began to see Ember not as a rescued animal, but as a partner. The dragon's ability to sense energy patterns, gravitational fluctuations, and electromagnetic fields was far beyond anything human technology could achieve. More than that, Ember seemed to understand the significance of what it was sensing. When something important appeared on the screens, the dragon would alert Jake with specific vocalizations, each one seemingly calibrated to the type of phenomenon being detected. Asterisk. The communication between them evolved rapidly. Jake found himself creating simple gestures to convey basic concepts, and Ember responded with its own sign language of wing positions and scale color changes. Within hours, they had developed a rudimentary but effective way to exchange ideas. Jake would point to something and say its name, and Ember would respond with a unique trill that seemed to be the dragon word for the same concept. The most remarkable moment came when Jake was trying to explain the concept of friendship. He pointed to himself, then to Ember, then clasped his hands together to represent a bond. Ember watched carefully, then did something that made Jake's heart skip a beat. The dragon reached out one small claw and gently touched Jake's hand, then brought that same claw to its own chest. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, a conscious choice to reciprocate the bond Jake was offering. It was during this moment of connection that Jake's communication system began receiving an unprecedented series of signals. The station's long-range sensors were detecting massive gravitational disturbances throughout the sector, patterns that suggested something enormous was moving through hyperspace. The readings were unlike anything in Jake's experience, showing energy signatures that dwarfed even the largest human starships. Ember's reaction to these readings was immediate and dramatic. The dragon's scales shifted to a deep red color Jake had never seen before, and its musical vocalizations became urgent, almost frantic. It flew to the main display and began gesturing wildly at the approaching signals. Its distress obvious even without shared language, Jake realized with growing alarm that Ember recognized these signatures. Whatever was coming, it was familiar to the dragon, and that familiarity was causing genuine fear. Jake tried to comfort his companion, but Ember's agitation only increased as the signals grew stronger. The dragon kept pointing at the display, then at itself, then making sweeping gestures that seemed to indicate vast numbers. The computer's analysis confirmed Jake's worst fears. The approaching objects were massive, numerous, and moving in perfect formation. Whatever was coming was organized, intelligent, and powerful beyond anything humanity had encountered. The energy signatures suggested living creatures rather than mechanical ships, beings capable of traveling through hyperspace under their own power. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process the implications. If these were more dragons, and if they were coming in response to Ember's presence on the station, then his act of kindness might have triggered something far beyond his ability to control. The formations were too precise, too military in their organization, to be anything other than a deliberate response to a perceived threat. As the hours passed, the approaching force grew closer, and Jake could see that his estimates had been conservative. The readings suggested not hundreds, but thousands of individual creatures, each one larger than Ember by several orders of magnitude. The formation was approaching the station with inexorable purpose, and Jake realized he was about to face a first contact scenario that no human had ever imagined. Ember's behavior became increasingly protective as the force approached. The dragon positioned itself between Jake and the viewports, its scales now cycling through rapid color changes that seemed to be some form of communication. Jake began to understand that Ember was not just afraid, it was preparing for something significant. The dragon's posture suggested it was trying to shield Jake from whatever was coming, a gesture of loyalty that both touched and terrified him. The station's automated systems began triggering security protocols as the approaching force entered. The outer detection grid, warning lights flashed throughout the corridors, and the computer's voice announced the detection of multiple unknown contacts. Jake overrode the automated distress beacon, knowing that any human response would only make the situation worse. This was something he would have to face alone, with only Ember as his ally. As the first shapes became visible through the station's viewports, Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. They were dragons, but unlike anything he could have imagined, these were creatures of impossible size and majesty, their scales reflecting the light of distant stars like living constellations. They moved with perfect coordination, their massive wings creating patterns of shadow and light that spoke of intelligence far older than human. Civilization. The lead dragon was larger than the others, its scales shifting through colors that had no names in human language. As it approached the station, Jake could see ancient wisdom in its eyes, a depth of knowledge that made him feel like a child in the presence of eternity. This was no mere animal. This was a being that had witnessed the birth and death of stars, a creature whose existence spanned eons. Ember's reaction to the sight of the approaching dragons was complex, mixing fear with what appeared to be recognition and even joy. The dragon flew to the viewport and began making rapid vocalizations toward the approaching force, its scales now pulsing with patterns that seemed to be a form of long-distance communication. Jake realized he was witnessing a reunion, but the circumstances suggested it might not be the joyful homecoming he had hoped for. The massive dragons took positions around the station, their formation creating a sphere of living creatures that completely surrounded Jake's small outpost. They did not attack, but their presence was so overwhelming that Jake felt like an ant in the shadow of giants. The lead dragon approached the station's main viewport and fixed its ancient gaze on Jake, studying him with an intensity that seemed to look directly into his soul. In that moment, Jake understood that everything he thought he knew about the universe was about to change. The dragons had come, and their presence would reshape not just his own life, but the destiny of humanity itself. With Ember at his side, Jake prepared to face whatever judgment these ancient beings had brought with them across the vast emptiness of space. Asterisk.